hope you're enjoying the series, the short series. I'm trying to keep it short. On the New Testament mythology. We're going to do more of these. I'm hoping maybe almost all my mythology stuff I can make in short form. And you can see it in short form. But our next argument today, when somebody happens to say, maybe alludes to, or even says outright that the New Testament's obviously mythology, or more mildly, I think it's probably more mythical, or maybe it's legendary. Don't smart people kind of go run to that possibility? Not necessarily. When people challenge the New Testament, the most common one now amongst skeptics, if they'll even give you an alternate view besides its supernaturalness, that the metaphysics are real and Jesus' resurrection was authentic, they'll usually run to hallucination. That's where but many won't even give you an alternative explanation because they know there's so many problems riddled with one that's not that says that the Gospels are something other than what they actually say they are. So what's our next argument? It'll be numbered 4 when we switch to the PowerPoint here in a moment, but it's basically this. If you are assessing the idea of this being closer to history, maybe with some, some features of ancient history making or even biography making that are in there as well, like chronological displacement that are in ancient biography, as well as telescoping or that sort of thing. If you're accounting for that and saying, well, it still has a stronger connection to history than mythology, you might ask, well, what sort of people were these Gospels initially aimed at? Especially when you get to the Gospel of Matthew. And that comes to our next critique here. The Jews of the period were not predisposed to believe and commend this type of myth or legend. Instead, if you look across the ancient Jewish literature, which is substantive, you get this idea of the resurrection of all Jews at the end of time. Non-Trinitarianism, there's a lot packed into that. It would have been considered deeply blasphemous for Jews of any stripe to act like God had a co-equal, that there was some other. This would be approaching a very, very twofold danger. One, the danger of polytheism, which ever present with those just dealing with general revelation in the ancient world. And then 2, you leaving your cultural distinctive, which you get in the Shema, right? Hear, O Israel, Lord our God is one God. And then last, an expected military Messiah, So the one here that we'll put it in a question format would be the idea that Jews had a predisposition based on teaching and some of their own legends and myths, usually having to do with the angels and things like that, covering the Old Testament time period, that would not predispose them to believe this. There's 2 reasons, very quickly, if you drop this down, the Jews weren't predisposed. One was their entire culture was based around the uniqueness of them being monotheists. That doesn't mean that polytheism didn't creep in. That's the whole drama of the Old Testament, that this culturally pervasive polytheism, which was again a general revelatory mutation, a general revelation, good, positive, there's a God, right? The starry host above had to be created by someone. The moral law within has to be underwritten by someone, but would get mutated into a self-serving polytheism. This was a very pervasive thing in the ancient world. The Jews fought hard for that cultural distinctive. The second is Jews probably had, you could make the argument that Jews were one of the more studious and fastidious with regard to them recording their history because they were always an embattled, smaller but blessed nation. They had a really, really strong propensity collectively to record what happened to them, to leave a record, to look back, to move forward. So in a twofold way, the Jews of this time period were theologically non-disposed to believe this type of myth, that a God-man would come among them and would die in order to save the whole world through their lineage, instead of elevating their lineage back to Davidic dominance in the area, in the local geographical area, on the geopolitical spectrum. And Jews as a culture were extraordinarily fastidious about recording what had happened and getting a record in there. Again, that doesn't mean they didn't have the same vagaries of other cultures with regard to keeping a record, but because they were such an embattled, but through all these years, because they were blessed, neither annihilated nor assimilated, they had this sort of thing going on. So if you want to put this in a question, it'd be something like this. You say the New Testament's mythology. Have you ever thought about the group of people that Jesus was witnessing to first, and the first converts were Jews, first century monotheistic Jews, who even under Roman oppression at the time were doing what? Were endeavoring mightily to try not to just get assimilated or melded syncretistically into the culture. I'm not going to say all that syncretistic stuff. Here it is. The Jews as a culture, theologically, and socially were not predisposed to believing these kind of myths with this kind of content. Okay, they weren't. They were a culture of record, an embattled culture that thought historic record was very, very, very important, especially when they get conquered and the monarchy's no longer there. They have these prophetic promises they're looking at for verification. And then you have a second thing that this particular type of myth, the God Man, or what some of the scholars called in the early 20th century, the Theos Aner, the God Man, the Greek there, that this they would not be predisposed to this kind of the content in this myth or the culture of myth making very, very common going on as both a hybrid sort of entertainment and religious commitment you have in the Greco-Roman culture. So join us next time as we go over another issue with interpreting the New Testament as mythology or legend.